April 8th, 2026. A ceasefire was announced. Trump posted that the bombing stops. Iran said the strait opens. Pakistan brokered the deal. Markets surged. The world exhaled. And the USS Tripoli didn't move an inch. 3,500 Marines, F-35B stealth fighters, MV-22 Ospreys, CH-53E Super Stallions, Viper attack helicopters, all of it still sitting in the Arabian Sea, live fire drills still running on the flight deck the morning after a ceasefire was supposed to end weeks of war. Because here is the reality that no press conference has fully explained. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow choke point that controls roughly 20% of the world's oil supply, was not open the morning after the deal was announced. Iran was restricting passage. Ships were waiting, and the largest marine amphibious force assembled in the Middle East in years had not been stood down. The ceasefire happened. The strait did not open, and the Marines are still there. The USS Tripoli Amphibious Ready Group is operating in the Arabian Sea, carrying approximately 3,500 sailors and Marines from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit. Aboard the Tripoli, F-35B Lightning II stealth fighters, MV-22B Ospreys, and CH-53E Super Stallion helicopters. Every aircraft on that flight deck can take off vertically. Every aircraft on that flight deck can operate without a runway. The USS Boxer Amphibious Ready Group is en route to the same theater, carrying the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit. The Boxer was still sailing toward the region during the ceasefire. A second major amphibious force, still in transit, still on course, during a pause in hostilities that was announced to the world as a resolution. Together, the Tripoli ARG and the Boxer ARG represent the largest marine amphibious concentration assembled in the Middle East in years. At least 16 destroyers are operating in the region. At least one submarine. More than 50,000 American troops total across the theater. This is not a routine deployment rotation. Routine rotations do not require two amphibious ready groups operating simultaneously in the same confined theater. Routine rotations do not involve live fire exercises on the flight deck the morning after a ceasefire announcement. The scale of what has been assembled tells you something that the press conferences did not. To understand why this force cannot simply be repositioned or sent home, you need to understand what the F-35B does that no other aircraft in the American inventory can replicate in this theater. The F-35B Lightning. 2 is a short takeoff. Vertical landing stealth fighter. It does not need a catapult. It does not need a long flight deck. It can lift off from the USS Tripoli's flight deck the way a helicopter lifts off a rooftop, straight up in confined waters in a contested environment. Every other fixed-wing stealth platform in the U.S. arsenal requires a conventional carrier with a full-length flight deck and thousands of feet of open water ahead of it to operate. The Strait of Hormuz, at its narrowest point, is 24 miles wide. A conventional carrier strike group operating inside that choke point would be doing so within range of Iran's entire coastal defense arsenal. Anti-ship ballistic missiles, Shahed attack drones, fast attack boat swarms, and naval mines seeded across the approaches. The Tripoli was not sent here because it was available. It was sent here because it is the only platform that can put stealth fighters in the air inside that corridor and still maneuver. The MV-22B Ospreys aboard the Tripoli can move Marines from ship to shore at 280 miles per hour. The CH-53E Super Stallions can lift armored vehicles and heavy equipment in a single load. This is not a patrol presence. This is an assault-configured force, purpose-built for vertical insertion into a contested coastal objective. The force is in position. The mission is defined by the geography. What is not yet defined is whether the ceasefire actually solved the problem the force was assembled to solve. On the evening of April 8th, just hours before Trump's stated deadline expired, a ceasefire was announced. The United States said it had halted military strikes on Iran. Washington claimed all military objectives had been met. The Strait of Hormuz, American officials stated, would be completely, immediately, and safely reopened. Trump described receiving a 10-point proposal from Iran, which he called a workable basis on which to negotiate. He added that almost all points of past contention had been agreed to, and that a 2-week period would allow the final agreement to be formalized. That sounds definitive, complete, resolved. Now read what Iran's own 10-point proposal actually contains. Iran's Supreme National Security Council spelled out the terms as Tehran understood them. The document described controlled passage through the Strait of Hormuz, coordinated with Iran's armed forces. It described the establishment of a secure transit protocol ensuring Iran's control over the waterway under the agreed framework. Iran did not agree to open the strait. Iran agreed to control it under a new name. Part of Iran's proposal, on the same proposal Trump described as a workable basis, included allowing Tehran to continue determining which ships pass and when. That framework would represent a fundamental departure from the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which guarantees transit passage through international straits and explicitly prohibits coastal states from charging foreign vessels for that passage. The ceasefire did not resolve the Hormuz question, it deferred it. And the two versions of what was agreed, Washington's and Tehran's, are not reconcilable on paper, let alone in the water. On April 9th, the day after the ceasefire, there was no sign that the announced opening of the Strait of Hormuz was being implemented. Ships were once again being prevented from crossing. Abu Dhabi National Oil Company CEO Sultan Al Jaber stated publicly that the strait was still not open despite the ceasefire, because Iran was restricting and conditioning traffic. He added that 230 loaded oil tankers were waiting inside the Gulf. 230 tankers. Stranded. The morning after the deal was announced. More than 800 vessels total were sitting idle inside the Persian Gulf, waiting for a strait that was announced open and remained effectively closed. The IEA had already characterized the closure as the worst energy supply disruption since the 1970s. That assessment was still in effect the morning after the ceasefire was celebrated on the front pages. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth told reporters at a press briefing that the strait was open. Joint Chiefs Chairman Dan Kane, asked directly whether the strait was open at that moment, gave this answer: "I believe so, based on the diplomatic negotiation." Based on the diplomatic negotiation, not based on tankers moving, not based on ships transiting, based on what had been agreed on paper. That is not an open strait. That is a diplomat's answer to a military question. And the Marines staying in position is the military's answer to that same question. New footage released by U.S. Central Command shows U.S. Marines conducting live fire exercises aboard the USS Tripoli in the Arabian Sea. The footage was released after the ceasefire was announced. CENTCOM chose to release it. That choice was not accidental. This is a message to Iran and to the captains of the 800 vessels sitting stranded inside the Persian Gulf, that the military option has not been withdrawn. The ceasefire paused the bombing. It did not stand down the force. Reuters, citing U.S. officials, reported that the United States was continuing to deploy thousands of Marines to the Middle East, coinciding with the 2-week ceasefire window. More than 50,000 American troops were in the region. Marines from San Diego were being continuously transported to the theater during the same period the administration was publicly describing the conflict as effectively resolved. The United States was deploying more Marines during the ceasefire than it was in the week before it. That is not the posture of a military that believes the deal is done. Kharg Island, It sits in the northeastern Persian Gulf, approximately 25 kilometers off the Iranian coast. It is Iran's primary crude oil export terminal, the single facility through which the majority of Iranian oil exports flow. Trump told the Financial Times that Washington could exercise this option. Military analysts have described it as the only leverage play that changes Iran's calculation on Hormuz. Because Iranian control of the strait generates revenue and strategic leverage only as long as Iran's own oil infrastructure remains intact. To reach Kharg Island, the Tripoli and the Boxer must first transit the Strait of Hormuz. At its narrowest point, 24 miles wide, every ship in both amphibious ready groups would be passing within range of Iran's coastal defense arsenal. Anti-ship ballistic missiles, shade attack drones, fast attack boat swarms, naval mines seated across the approaches. Even after a successful transit and a successful seizure, holding Kharg against sustained drone and missile barrages from the Iranian mainland approximately 20 miles away across open water would be a protracted fight. The highest strategic priority is getting the tankers moving. The only way to force that outcome, if the Islamabad talks fail, is to make the cost of Iranian obstruction higher than the cost of compliance. The Marines are exactly where they need to be for that option to remain viable. The talks in Islamabad began on April 10th. What they must produce is not a restatement of the ceasefire terms. They must resolve the fundamental question the 10-point proposal deliberately left open: whether the Strait of Hormuz operates under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea or under an Iranian-controlled framework that gives Tehran authority over who passes and when. Those two positions are not variations of the same outcome. They are incompatible. The gap between them is not a detail to be finalized. It is the entire dispute. The USS Boxer is still sailing toward the theater. The 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit is still aboard. The Kharg option remains on the table. The F-35Bs on the Tripoli's flight deck are still armed. A ceasefire was announced. Oil prices dropped. Markets surged. And the USS Tripoli kept running live fire drills in the Arabian Sea because 230 oil tankers are still stranded in the Gulf. More than 800 vessels are waiting on a deal that Iran's own proposal says gives Tehran control over who passes and when. The strait that was supposed to open the morning after the ceasefire is still effectively closed. A ceasefire is not an open strait. A 10-point proposal is not freedom of navigation. A 2-week pause in hostilities is not the end of the dispute that produced them. The talks in Islamabad are running. The 2-week clock is running. And somewhere in the Arabian Sea, 3,500 Marines are still on the flight deck, still armed, still ready. Because the mission is not over until the tankers are moving. And the tankers are not moving yet.